air in Elias Thorne's workshop in northern Maine always carried the same familiar scent. A rich, earthy blend of old paper, sun-dried leather, and the faint, sweet decay of forgotten knowledge. Dust motes danced in the lone shaft of afternoon light that pierced the grimy window, illuminating the careful chaos of his trade. He was a restorer of ancient books, a quiet man in a quiet corner of the world, his days spent coaxing life back into brittle spines and faded script. It was a measured, almost monastic existence, far removed from the brutal, bloody legacy that coiled beneath his skin like a sleeping serpent. He worked with meticulous precision, his long, slender fingers scarred in subtle ways by errant blades and the sharp edges of time, turning the vellum leaves of a 17th century German folio. The book, bound in scarred pigskin, depicted not the usual biblical scenes or courtly romances, but grotesque engravings. Men with crude spears facing off against hulking, snarling beasts whose eyes held a chillingly human intelligence. Hunters like his ancestors. Beasts like the ones his ancestors hunted. These were not mere artistic flights of fancy. They were blueprints of an ancient war, etched by hands that knew the true horror. Elias had inherited this quiet life, just as he had inherited the books, the workshop, and the silent, crushing weight of the Thorne family's covenant. The Brotherhood of Silver, as it had been known in the hushed annals of Central Europe, had taken root in the twilight years of the 17th century. It was not some romantic crusade, but a chillingly practical response to an undeniable, unholy truth. The night beasts, the lycanthropes, were not simple brutes driven by instinct. They were intelligent, cunning, and their true strength lay not in claw and fang, but in an insidious ability to mimic, to deceive, to wear human skin like a well-tailored suit. His family's chronicles, painstakingly recorded in a series of ledgers hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his study, spoke of the first hunters. Practical men, some scholars, some village elders, some even priests, who noticed the anomalies. The wolves in human skin understood language, planned their movements, and vanished without a trace. They learned, through generations of bloody trial and error, how to forge silver. Not just any silver, but silver blessed and alloyed with specific herbs whose properties were lost to mainstream science. They developed ingenious traps, not for animals, but for a creature that picked locks or slipped through a crowded marketplace. Most crucially, they honed the art of observation, learning to recognize the errors, the subtle tells that betrayed the monster beneath the skin. A flicker in the eyes that was too sharp, too cold. A gait that was too fluid, too effortless, or conversely, a stiffness that was a shade off-human. A faint, almost imperceptible scent like ozone and wet dog clung to their human guise for those with the training to notice. The chronicles also detailed the insidious evolution of their enemy. During the 30 Years' War, the beasts melted into the streams of refugees, their hunger masked by the widespread famine and chaos. They used the Black Death as a smokescreen, their nocturnal depredations blamed on contagion and fear. They learned to forge documents, to buy influence, to pass as merchants, clerks, and even minor nobility, always one step ahead of the few who knew what they truly were. Each entry was a stark reminder of their strategic thinking, their terrifying capacity for long-term planning, a chilling testament to an ancient intelligence that grew with every passing century. The Thorns, along with a handful of other families, had been forced across the Atlantic in the mid-19th century. This was not a flight from persecution, as history recorded it, but a strategic pursuit. The nascent United States, a land of boundless frontiers and endless opportunities, had proven irresistible to the first werewolf packs. They blended seamlessly with the waves of European immigrants, their ancient hunger finding new fertile ground in the burgeoning cities and sprawling wilderness of the New World. And the Brotherhood had followed, a silent, necessary shadow trailing in their wake. Elias often found himself staring out at the mist-shrouded pines of his main property, a profound sense of isolation clinging to him like the scent of old paper. His life was a constant vigilance, a silent burden that precluded any semblance of normalcy. He formed no lasting relationships, shared no intimate details of his world, and trusted no one without a gnawing suspicion. The constant need to be on guard, to read every shadow, to analyze every stranger, molded him into a silent, watchful observer, a man adrift in a world that refused to see the truth. It was a sacrifice made not for glory, but for a knowledge too terrible to ignore. He was a sentinel at the edge of the abyss, and the abyss always watched him back. That night the dream came, sharp and cold as a winter wind. He was in a castle, a place from an ancestral memory, all damp stone and flickering torchlight. A shadow, not quite a wolf, but unmistakably lupine, slid along the ancient walls, impossibly swift and silent. It was not just a shadow, it was a presence, a living malevolence. The shadow flowed, coalesced, then expanded, stretching and pulling until it formed a face. Not a beast's face, not exactly. It was human, all too human, but twisted with a chilling, knowing smirk. The eyes, glinting like polished obsidian, held an ancient amusement, a boundless contempt. They looked not at him, but through him, into the very core of his being. Elias woke with a gasp, his sheets tangled, his skin clammy with cold sweat. The silence of his remote home was oppressive, broken only by the frantic thump of his own heart. The smirk, so full of sly, triumphant intelligence, burned behind his eyelids. He knew, with an icy certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the long, quiet truce was over. The game, his family's ancient, eternal game, was about to begin again. And this time, something felt profoundly, irrevocably different. The premonition of the nightmare clung to Elias like damp cloth, even as the cold, gray light of dawn crept through his workshop window. The smell of strong coffee did little to dispel the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He moved through his morning routine with deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness, checking the locks, testing the old alarm system. Each action a silent affirmation of the ancient threat he had only ever kept at bay. Then, the small, nondescript pager on his belt, an antique piece of technology that looked laughably out of place in the digital age, gave a series of sharp, coded beeps. It was a pattern he had not heard in years, a sequence signaling extreme urgency. Elias moved to a hidden compartment in his study, retrieving a clunky, heavily shielded laptop computer. He keyed in a complex series of commands. The screen flickered with lines of code before revealing a short, stark message. It was from Alan Crawford, his old mentor, the last living member of the Brotherhood's clandestine council. The message was terse, almost brutal in its efficiency, activating long, dormant protocols that felt ancient and primal, even in their digital form. The words on the screen were a punch to the gut. Montana, Wyoming. Reports of predation. Unnatural. Then followed a string of coordinates and dates, each marking a spot on the vast, untamed map of the American West. The details, filtered through Allen's terse summary, painted a grim picture. Entire herds of cattle, torn apart with a ferocity that defied explanation, their carcasses left in a state of grotesque dismemberment. Then, the escalating horror. Missing persons, hikers, and isolated ranchers, whose remains, when found, were fragmented, scattered, and completely drained of blood. Elias scrolled through the links provided, pages from local newspapers and online news outlets from the affected regions. The official narrative was consistent, almost comically so. Grizzly attack spike in backcountry, one headline blared, dismissing the strange patterns of predation. Another, even more absurd, spoke of dangerous poachers and cult activity, trying to rationalize the sheer brutality of some of the scenes. The local police, along with the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife, worked overtime to spin a story, to reassure the anxious populace. But to Elias, the placid words were a thin veil over a churning abyss. He saw the gaps immediately, the glaring inconsistencies that were invisible to anyone not steeped in the Brotherhood's ancient knowledge. The reported wound patterns, for example, described bear attacks, but with a precision of dismemberment that no animal, no matter how enraged, achieved. The unusual tracks, sometimes a jumble of massive canine paw prints intermingling with surprisingly large, human-like boot impressions, then abruptly vanished. And the clean crime scenes, locations where, despite obvious evidence of a struggle and a horrific death, there was an unnatural lack of blood splatter. The victim had been moved after the initial attack. The most chilling detail, mentioned in a single, almost buried paragraph of one article, described a body found hanging from a tree branch, stripped clean, completely exsanguinated. No bear, no human poacher explained such a thing. That was the unmistakable signature. He contacted Allen on a shielded satellite line. The connection crackled faintly, a sound that carried the weight of centuries. Allen's voice was a low rasp, heavy with weariness, but firm. "I knew you'd see it, Elias," he said, skipping any pleasantries. "They're back. A sophisticated pack, this one. They were quiet for too long. They went deep after Europe, found the remote places. Now they've taken root." Allen shared his own long-held suspicions, born of decades of experience and an intimate knowledge of their enemy's history. "Not grizzlies," he affirmed, the word laced with grim finality. "Never grizzlies. It's an old pack, very clever. They've been using these mountains for decades, adapting, learning the land, learning us." A deep, primal weariness settled over Elias. He cherished his quiet life, the predictable rhythm of his work, the simple solace of his solitude. He had built a life on the fragile foundation of peace, a peace he knew was always borrowed. But the call of duty, the silent scream of his ancestors, and the horrifying image of innocent lives being torn apart, shattered that fragile peace. The responsibility for humanity, for those who lived in blissful ignorance, was a burden he could not shed. It was an inherited weight, and he carried it again. He went to his strong box, a relic of oiled steel and heavy brass, tucked away beneath his workshop bench. The lid creaked open, revealing a meticulously organized array of equipment that smelled of gun oil, dried leather, and something else, a faint metallic tang that was the scent of forgotten battles. He drew out a heavy revolver, its grips worn smooth from generations of use, its barrel gleaming dully. Next, a slim, silver-bladed hunting knife, its edge honed to razor sharpness, and the bullets, each one a gleaming, handcrafted silver projectile, nestled in velvet-lined slots. These were not for bears. He pulled an old, large-scale topographic map of Montana and Wyoming from the safe. Its creases were worn thin from countless unfoldings. Previous generations had marked their own battles upon its surface. With a dark pencil, Elias carefully circled the new areas of attack, the red marks spreading like a rash across the vast wilderness. A pattern emerged, a dark, malevolent bloom. It was the mark of a shadow, slowly, inexorably spreading across the American landscape. He went online and bought a plane ticket to Bozeman, Montana, a one-way trip, knowing with a leaden heart that he was returning to a hunt that was his last. The hum of his computer, a sound of the modern world, provided an unnerving counterpoint to the ancient dread that now filled him. The vast, indifferent landscape of Montana unfolded beneath Elias as his rental sport utility vehicle devoured the miles, a long steel ribbon cutting through the endless plains before rising into the jagged teeth of the mountains. Bozeman had been a blur of sterile airport terminals and indifferent faces. Now the air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the clean, biting scent of pine and distant snow. But beneath it, a subtle, more insidious odor clung to the small, isolated mountain town he was approaching. The unmistakable tang of fear. It hung heavy in the crisp autumn air, a palpable dread that seeped from every shuttered window and every averted gaze. He parked his vehicle, a nondescript Ford Explorer, and slipped into the role he'd crafted, a freelance journalist specializing in environmental issues and remote wildlife phenomena. He wore slightly rumpled clothes, carried a worn notebook, and cultivated an air of well-meaning but naive curiosity. It was a good cover, allowing him to ask the questions no one else dared to. His investigation began at the ragged edges of the known horror. He drove out to the scene of the most recent attack on a ranch. The air still thick with the coppery stench of drying blood and the sweet, sickly smell of fear-induced adrenaline. The torn-up corrals, splinters of treated lumber flung like kindling, told a story of impossible strength. He knelt in the churned earth, ignoring the yellow police tape that flapped idly in the breeze. The soil was a bewildering tapestry of prints. Some were undeniably massive wolf paws, deeply impressed, predatory. Others, impossibly, were clear imprints of large human boots, size 15 or 16, he estimated, a giant of a man. The unsettling detail: these two distinct sets of tracks mingled for a few yards, then simply vanished, the creatures transforming in an instant. A ranger had explained it away as a large grizzly on two legs, a dismissive chuckle following the statement, but Elias knew better. He spoke to the locals. A weathered old rancher, his eyes sunk deep into a face like cured leather, muttered about things not right in these mountains and stories his grandfather told. He spoke of how the cows were not just killed, but torn like a rag doll, and some, he swore, were just gone, no trace. But most, especially those who had already spoken to law enforcement, repeated the official lines with weary resignation. "Big bear, I reckon," they'd say, or just some crazy folks out there, doing bad things. Their eyes, however, betrayed the fear, the unspoken terror that gnawed at their souls. Elias searched their faces, seeking the ones who had seen more, the ones whose official stories did not quite match the wild, horrified glint in their eyes. He found them eventually in the subtle discrepancies, the tiny, almost invisible details no one else noticed. At one site, where a hunter had been found, shredded beyond recognition, Elias noted the unnatural precision of the wounds, almost surgical in their execution, tearing along muscle lines with an impossible neatness. Yet there was no sign of a struggle, no broken branches, no scraped earth around the body itself. At another, a campsite where a family had vanished, the scene was one of overwhelming theatrical brutality. Tents ripped to shreds, gear strewn across a wide area. But Elias saw the two perfect claw marks on one tree, the way a specific branch had been snapped with deliberate care. It was not the blind fury of an animal. It was the calculated chaos of a message. They were fabricating evidence, carefully, subtly, to create the illusion of a wild animal or a savage human. He observed the federal and local law enforcement operations from a distance. Helicopters, still visible, crisscrossing the canyons. Patrol cars, their lights flashing, rumbling along isolated roads. The agents themselves, well-meaning and determined, were utterly lost. He saw their exasperation, their frustration, their growing confusion as each new lead led nowhere. They argued amongst themselves, each agency convinced its approach was the right one, creating a bureaucratic tangle that only added to the mounting chaos. It was a ballet of incompetence, unwitting pawns dancing to a tune they could not hear. As Elias delved deeper, a colder, more insidious psychological horror began to settle over him. This was not just about feeding. This was a campaign, a calculated strategy of terror. The killings were not random. They were designed to create fear, to misdirect, to draw attention away from the true nature of the threat. He saw how the fear infected the minds of the people, turning neighbors suspicious, making every stranger a potential enemy. It was a masterclass in manipulation, twisting human nature against itself. He himself was not immune to their trickery. On one occasion, following what he thought were fresh tracks, he stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin deep in a forgotten hollow. Inside, he found a meticulously staged scene. A worn journal with rambling, paranoid entries about mountain shadows and voices in the wind. A few empty cans, a tattered sleeping bag. It was designed to appear as if a mad hermit was responsible for the attacks. But Elias saw the dust on the cans, undisturbed for months, the journal placed perfectly on a rough-hewn table. It was a decoy, a carefully constructed illusion, and he nearly walked into a tripwire that would have sent a flare arcing into the sky, signaling his presence to anyone watching. The sheer depth of their intelligence, their ability to anticipate and mislead, sent a shiver of true dread down his spine. They were playing a long game, and humanity, for all its modern technology, was losing. The situation, already fraught, took a sudden, brutal turn. Another attack, this one in broad daylight, near a popular hiking trail. Several people were mauled, one of them a federal park ranger. The audacity, the sheer brazen contempt for human life, was too much for the authorities to ignore. Washington, roused from its bureaucratic slumber, declared the situation a biological threat of unknown origin, a term vague enough to sound authoritative yet communicate nothing. Within 48 hours, the mountains thrummed with a new, terrifying sound, the incessant thud of military helicopters. Elias watched from a hidden overlook as columns of heavily armored military utility vehicles rumbled down logging roads, Drones, sleek as dragonflies, crisscrossed the deep canyons, their infrared sensors scanning for any anomaly. Special operations forces, grim-faced and bristling with high-tech weaponry, systematically began sweeping through the dense pine forests and jagged peaks. It was an overwhelming display of force, a desperate, blunt instrument applied to a problem that demanded surgical precision. But Elias knew it was all a show, a grand, expensive spectacle for the news cameras and an anxious public. The military, trained to fight terrorists and conventional enemies, was entirely unprepared for this foe. They moved with the confident certainty of men who understood combat, yet they chased shadows that melted into the very earth, or, more chillingly, stood shoulder to shoulder with the uniformed men, unseen, unheard, utterly unsuspected. He saw the impressive formations, the synchronized movements, the state-of-the-art gear, and felt a profound, bitter despair. They expended immense resources, risking lives, all while aiming at thin air. It was a masterful illusion, and the werewolves were the directors. The creatures, it became agonizingly clear, were not just powerful, they were artistic in their deception, crafting a perfect illusion of natural, or at least understandable, violence. Elias, observing a new kill site after the military had swept through, noted the details that screamed of fabrication. Next to the mangled remains of a deer, the earth was purposefully churned, showing not only immense paw prints but also unmistakable boot marks, impossibly large, size 15, even 16, clearly suggesting a gigantic human hunter. But the stride length, the weight distribution, the way the print scuffed slightly at the heel, all were subtly wrong. They even planted a discarded semi-automatic rifle near the scene, a heavy weapon no human hunter would carelessly abandon. The official report, quickly leaked to the press, suggested anti-government extremists with military training were now implicated. At another site, where a woman had been savagely ripped apart, the scene was made to look like a frenzied wolf-pack attack, with claw marks and bite wounds everywhere. Yet, tucked into a fold of her tattered jacket, Elias found a single microscopic fiber, from a polyester blend suit he knew, the kind worn by men in offices, not beasts in the wild. A tiny, almost playful signature. In Washington, and in the temporary command centers set up in the mountains, a bureaucratic hell had erupted. Generals bellowed, politicians grandstanded, and high-ranking officials from various departments, Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Defense, even the Environmental Protection Agency, clashed in a cacophony of competing agendas. Some demanded more troops, a wider net, a full declaration of martial law. Others insisted on funding expensive biological research into a new predator. Still others argued for immediate mass evacuations, creating further panic. Each decision, each pronouncement, only served to deepen the confusion, to thicken the fog of war that the werewolves had so expertly manufactured. Elias understood, with a sickening certainty, that this entire circus was part of the enemy's master plan. The werewolves were not just reacting, they were orchestrating. They intentionally sowed chaos, manipulating human incompetence, playing on political ambitions and media hunger. In this maelstrom of confusion and conflicting directives, they did not just remain unnoticed. They actively expanded their networks, moving with impunity, their true forms hidden in plain sight, their agendas furthered by the very forces meant to stop them. He tried, in desperation, to intervene, anonymously feeding snippets of information to various online forums, sending cryptic electronic mail messages to journalists he'd met. He spoke of anomalies, of calculated deceptions, of an intelligence behind the attacks that defies conventional understanding. But his warnings were ignored as the ramblings of a doomsday prophet, or dismissed as deliberate disinformation from a conspiracy theorist. The official narrative, however absurd, held sway. The iron fist of ignorance was far stronger than the whisper of truth. Watching the futility of it all, the wasteful expenditures of resources, the danger to innocent soldiers, the endless circular arguments, Elias felt a cold despair settle deep in his gut. Humanity was fighting a phantom, flailing wildly at shadows, utterly unaware that the true enemy was not just physically superior, but intellectually dominant. They were playing a chess game, and humans had not even realized they were on the board. The wind howled through the canyons, a mournful, indifferent sound that mirrored the silent scream of frustration trapped within Elias. The crushing weight of governmental incompetence, the horrifying realization that the very institutions meant to protect humanity were blind, rendered Elias's quiet despair into a cold, hard resolve. There was no relying on the world's conventional defenses. Not anymore. He returned to the only path he knew, the one etched into his very blood. He reached out to the scattered remnants of the Brotherhood. The process was slow, painstaking, a series of encrypted messages and clandestine calls that hummed with the ghosts of 4 centuries. They were a disparate group, living quiet, unremarkable lives across the country, their true identities hidden behind the mundane. But they were all bound by the same ancient purpose, the same inherited curse, the same knowledge that set them apart. They were the last links in a chain forged in the crucible of medieval fear and hardened by centuries of hidden warfare. The first to arrive at the abandoned hunting cabin, a dilapidated structure tucked deep in a forgotten corner of Elias's ancestral land in Montana, was Maeve O'Connell. She was a woman cut from the same rugged cloth as the Wyoming wilderness she called home. Her face, weathered by sun and wind, was etched with a lifetime of vigilance, her eyes sharp and assessing. She was a tracker of unparalleled skill, her intuition for reading the land preternatural, a gift passed down through a line of Irish hunters who had joined the Brotherhood generations ago. Next came David Fisher, a former Marine whose bearing still spoke of discipline and lethal efficiency. His German lineage was evident in the stark lines of his face, the unwavering gaze. He was a master of modern weaponry, adapting ancient principles of combat to 21st century tools, a living bridge between the old world and the new. His movements were precise, economical, his silence more unnerving than any boast. Finally, there was Old Man Three Eagles, a quiet, spectral figure from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. He spoke little, his words like polished river stones, but his presence was immense. He brought with him the ancient ways, knowledge gleaned from the land itself, passed down through generations of shamans who had understood the true nature of the skinwalkers long before the Europeans arrived. He knew tracking methods that predated written history, rituals for warding, and a profound spiritual understanding of the predatory darkness they faced. The cabin itself was a relic belonging to Elias's family for generations. It smelled of damp earth, dried pine needles, and the ghosts of hunts past. They spent the first few days simply clearing it, an almost reverential act, as if preparing a sacred space. Dust motes danced in the sparse light, illuminating ancient maps tacked to the walls, side by side with crisp modern satellite imagery of the affected areas. It was here, in this remote, forgotten sanctuary, far from the prying eyes of civilization, that they began to forge their desperate plan. The preparation of their arsenal was a ritual in itself, a solemn act steeped in tradition and lethal intent. Silver melted down from heirloom coins and salvaged religious artifacts shimmered in crucibles over a roaring fire. The metallic scent mixing with the pungent aroma of dried wolfsbane and other consecrated herbs Maeve had gathered from secret mountain glades. Elias, his movements precise, poured the molten metal into ancient molds, each bullet painstakingly crafted, each one a promise of salvation or damnation. David, meanwhile, worked on their firearms, modifying high-powered hunting rifles and shotguns for quicker loading, for a heavier punch, for the specific task of stopping what was not quite human. He fitted special sights, adjusted stocks, ensuring each weapon was an extension of the hunter. Old Man Three Eagles prepared the lures, a potent, disturbing mixture of animal blood, specific gland secretions, and ancient herbal compounds, a stench that was, by all accounts, irresistible to the beasts, yet nauseating to humans. Hidden cameras, no larger than a thumb, and highly sensitive directional microphones were carefully prepared, their modern circuits a strange complement to the ancient wisdom they served. They shared their knowledge, spreading out maps and old leather-bound journals. Elias laid out the evidence of the recent attacks, the discrepancies, the deliberate misdirections. Maeve pointed out subtle shifts in the land, patterns of movement that defied natural animal behavior. David analyzed the military's response, showing how their tactics were perfectly predictable. Old Man Three Eagles spoke of shadow walkers who learned human ways, who mirrored human thought. They concluded with chilling certainty that the current pack was not just hunting. They were studying, meticulously analyzing the reactions of human society, the weaknesses of its government, the predictability of its defenses. Moments of doubt, like cold currents, rippled through the group. They knew the odds were against them, brutally so. Each of them had lost someone to this ancient war. A parent, a sibling, a friend. The grim faces, etched with exhaustion and haunted memories, bore witness to the profound personal cost of their heritage. This was not just a mission, it was their last stand, a desperate final gamble against an enemy that had, for centuries, grown smarter, more cunning, more powerful. Elias, bearing the weight of his lineage, felt the crushing burden of leadership. He could not afford to repeat the mistakes of the past, to underestimate the enemy. The plan began to take shape, audacious and risky. It was a strategy born of desperation, but also of a profound understanding of their enemy's hubris. They used the werewolves' arrogance, their newfound confidence in their ability to manipulate humanity, against them. They created an illusion, a trap so perfectly convincing that even the most cunning predator walked right into it, blinded by its own sense of superiority. The final briefing was short, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. Elias's voice was low, strained, but firm. Silence, coordination, ruthlessness. "This isn't just a hunt," he said, looking at each of them in turn. "This is it, for all of us, for everyone who doesn't even know they're in a war." The hunters moved through the vast, indifferent wilderness of the Gallatin National Forest like ghosts, their movements synchronized, silent, a stark contrast to the thundering presence of the military forces that continued to patrol the region. The air grew colder as they ascended, the scent of damp earth and pine needles sharpening with the altitude. They split into two-person teams, each carefully chosen for complementary skills, spreading out to establish an active observation network. Their mission: to study the werewolves and the military without being detected by either. Elias, paired with Maeve, climbed to a high, secluded ridge, establishing a temporary observation post camouflaged with fallen branches and rock. He set up a suite of sensors, hidden cameras no bigger than a thumbnail, their lenses peering from behind lichen-covered stones. Thermal imagers that painted the night in ghostly shades of heat. Directional microphones capable of picking up a whisper from a quarter-mile away. Maeve, meanwhile, read the land, her eyes scanning for disturbed earth, for the subtle bend of a branch, for the almost imperceptible changes that spoke of recent passage. It did not take long for the chilling patterns to emerge. The werewolves coordinated their movements with the military's patrols. After a squadron of Army military transport helicopters thumped their way through a valley, their searchlights carving swathes out of the darkness, a fresh attack occurred, often in a neighboring canyon, hours later. It was too precise, too deliberate. It was no coincidence. The beasts used the military's presence as a cover, a means to drive prey, or to divert attention. The helicopters flushed the area, and the werewolves struck, making it appear as though the military was effectively pushing the threat out of one zone, only for it to reappear in another. It was a sophisticated game of cat and mouse, with the military unknowingly playing the role of the herd dog. Then came the truly insidious discovery. David, working with 3 eagles, tracked a set of footprints, human, perfectly normal-sized, but unusually heavy, from one of the kill sites to a remote cabin. Inside, they found a local trapper, a grizzled old man known for his eccentricities. He was clearly disturbed, muttering about voices and bad dreams, but he was not a werewolf. What they realized through painstaking observation was that the werewolves used these agents of influence, unsuspecting locals, often isolated or vulnerable, whom they manipulated through subtle suggestion, fear, or a form of psychic coercion. These poor souls then, unknowingly, performed small tasks, leaving a false trail of game offal in a specific direction, making a suspicious phone call that drew law enforcement away from a real attack, or planting a piece of evidence that reinforced the official narrative. It was a horrifying twist. An ancient predator weaponizing human psychology and bureaucracy against itself. The detective element of the hunt, once focused on finding physical errors, now extended into the realm of human weakness. The template of their enemy's strategy became horrifyingly clear. First, provoke panic. Second, wait for governmental intervention. Third, manipulate those interventions, using the resulting chaos to their own ends. Their goals were not simply sustenance. They were about establishing control. Control over territory, control over information, control over the narrative. It was a strategy for dominance, not mere survival. The double danger of their situation was underscored during one tense observation. Elias and Maeve tracked a potential target, a large male werewolf in its human guise, when a military patrol stumbled upon their position. A squad of special operations personnel, moving with practiced efficiency, emerged from the tree line, their rifles raised. Elias and Maeve froze, pressed flat against the cold rock, barely visible in the fading light. The air grew thick with tension, the metallic tang of fear in Elias's mouth. They heard the low, guttural commands, the rustle of gear, the heavy boots on the uneven ground. They were not spotted, the soldiers passing within yards of their hiding place. The incident left Elias with a profound, chilling understanding. They were enemies to both sides, hunted by the very people they sought to protect, and pursued by the monsters they had sworn to eradicate. The more they uncovered about the werewolves' intricate planning, their chilling foresight, their ability to weave themselves into the fabric of the landscape and the human mind, the heavier the psychological pressure grew. They were not facing animals, or even merely intelligent predators. They were up against a highly organized, utterly ruthless intelligence that thought not just one but several steps ahead. It was like battling a chess grandmaster who also moved pawns on the board of reality. Then, a quiet, unnoticed discovery by Old Man Three Eagles, poring over ancient texts in the flickering lamplight of the cabin, sent a jolt of ice through Elias. In a brittle, centuries-old European chronicle, translated painstakingly from a forgotten dialect, Three Eagles found a recurring phrase: the Grey Advisors. These were mentions of werewolves who, not just centuries ago, but millennia past, had infiltrated local administrations, minor royal courts, even religious orders. They had served not as brutal beasts, but as whispers in the ears of power, guiding, manipulating, subtly shaping human destiny for their own ends. The detail chilled Elias to the bone, a profound, sickening hint that the problem was far, far deeper than anyone had ever dared to imagine. It was not just a hunt, it was an infestation. The grim, heavy silence of the cabin was punctuated only by the scratch of pencil on paper and the soft hiss of the kerosene lamp. Based on the chilling data they'd gathered, the military's unwitting compliance, the manipulated locals, the deliberate misdirection, the Brotherhood now forged a counterplan. It was daring, suicidal, and the only path left. They constructed the ultimate trap, one so meticulously crafted, so utterly convincing in its deception, that even the werewolves, for all their cunning and ancient intelligence, did not recognize the hook. They chose their ground with the precision of master strategists. Not a wide-open plain, easily monitored by military eyes, but a deep, serpentine gorge carved into the heart of the Gallatin National Forest. It was a place known locally as the Whispering Maw, its steep, shadowed walls rarely touched by sunlight, its unpredictable weather a constant menace, and its labyrinthine network of hidden caves and crevices a perfect sanctuary for any creature that wished to remain unseen. It was a place where the military did not venture quickly, where the werewolves themselves felt an ancient, ingrained sense of security. The preparation of the battlefield was a painstaking, almost sacred endeavor, each step infused with desperate hope and a prayer to forgotten gods. They established a perimeter of nearly invisible infrared sensors, wired to small, silent alarms on Elias's console, capable of detecting the minute heat signature of a passing body, human or otherwise. Directional microphones no bigger than a beetle were cemented into rock faces pointed inward, ready to capture the faintest rustle of fur, the softest snarl. They dug shallow, narrow pits, camouflaging them with incredible care, each one lined with wicked, razor-sharp silver spikes, their tips gleaming faintly even in the dim light. David set up the powerful ultrasonic repellers devices based on ancient folklore and modern technology that disoriented werewolves, filling their minds with a deafening internal shriek that scrambled their senses and stripped them of their human cunning. These were hidden deep within rock formations, designed to be activated remotely. Every position for the shooters was chosen for maximum concealment and a clear line of fire, each one a silent promise of death. Roles were assigned with cold, clinical precision. Maeve, with her eagle eyes and steady hand, took the primary sniper position, overlooking the entrance to the gorge. David, his marine training evident in every tense muscle, was the main distraction, the bait designed to draw the pack in. 3 eagles coordinated the support and cover, his ancient knowledge of the terrain invaluable for their escape routes. Elias took on the crushing mantle of coordinator, his eyes fixed on the array of monitors and maps, his finger hovering over the activation buttons. The burden of leadership pressed down on Elias like a physical weight, heavier than any of the silver bullets he'd molded. He was responsible not only for his own life, but for the lives of his companions, the last remnants of a 400-year lineage. He saw the ghosts of his ancestors, their successes and their failures, whispering in the shadows. His greatest fear was not death. It was repeating their mistakes, underestimating the enemy, allowing another generation to be lost to this insidious foe. He remembered the smirk in his dream, the knowing intelligence, and a cold dread settled in his gut. The night before the operation, Elias found himself talking to Alan on the encrypted line, the old man's voice a frail whisper from across the continent. "They're too smart, Elias," Alan rasped, his voice filled with a profound, ancient weariness. "Too human. They don't just hunt with claws and teeth anymore. They hunt with information. That's their invisible weapon now. Be careful, boy. Trust nothing." The old man's words hung in the air, a final chilling warning that resonated with the discoveries of the Grey advisors. The final briefing was held in hushed tones, illuminated by the flickering light of the single kerosene lamp. Eyes met across the rough-hewn table, each gaze a mixture of grim determination and unspoken fear. Elias reiterated the critical points. Absolute silence, perfect coordination, utter ruthlessness. There was no mercy, no hesitation. This was not a hunt for sport, or even just for survival. This was a defining battle, its outcome unknown, its existence unknown to the sleeping world. But for them, it was everything. The fate of humanity, however ignorant, rested on their silver-laden bullets and their iron wills. As the lamp's flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, Elias felt the cold steel of his revolver in his hand, a tangible link to centuries of vengeance and sacrifice. The journey to the Whispering Maw was a test of raw endurance, a silent, grueling procession under the skeletal fingers of the moon. They moved like shadows themselves through the brutal, unforgiving terrain of the national forest. The air was a knife edge of cold, cutting through their thermal gear, and the deep, powdery snow swallowed their footsteps, making each step a laborious, silent struggle. Icy rivers, their surface glittering like polished obsidian, had to be forded, the frigid water biting at their skin, threatening to steal the warmth from their bones. Every muscle ached. Every breath plumed white in the frigid air, but there was no sound save for the crunch of their boots and the ragged rhythm of their own breathing. It was a constant battle against the elements and against the crushing weight of impending confrontation. They reached the gorge just before the deepest part of the night. The maw lived up to its name, a gaping, shadowed chasm that swallowed the meager moonlight, its walls rising like ancient, silent sentinels. With the practiced efficiency of seasoned hunters, they dispersed, melting into their pre-assigned positions. Maeve scaled a sheer rock face with unnerving grace, her silhouette disappearing against the jagged skyline. David and 3 eagles moved to opposite flanks, their forms merging with the dense undergrowth and the deceptive shadows. Elias established his field command center in a small, sheltered alcove overlooking the main ambush zone, carefully arranging his monitors and communication gear. The air was heavy with anticipation, thick enough to taste. With a series of quiet clicks, Elias activated the ancient pheromone lure. From 3 concealed dispensers, a potent, almost nauseating scent began to waft into the frigid mountain air. It was a grotesque blend. The rich, metallic tang of fresh animal blood, cut with the musky, alluring pheromones of rutting deer, and underscored by the cloying herbal sweetness of specific consecrated botanicals. According to the Brotherhood's deepest lore, this combination was an irresistible yet deeply disorienting siren song for the creatures, an overwhelming call to their most primal instincts. It hung in the air, a sinister promise of both sustenance and oblivion. Then they waited. The hours stretched, agonizingly slow, each minute a tiny eternity. The cold leached into Elias's bones, turning his fingers stiff, but he remained unmoving, his gaze fixed on the thermal readouts, his ears straining against the vast, empty silence. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind, every distant snap of a twig was magnified 1,000 times, each sound a potential harbinger of doom. The tension was a living thing, a cold, tightening coil in the pit of his stomach. Finally, just as the moon began its slow descent, the first signs appeared. A sound, distant at first, then closer, a low, guttural cry that was not quite a wolf's howl, but rather a chilling, mocking laugh, echoing unnaturally through the canyon. It raised the hairs on Elias's neck. Then, on the thermal monitors, a series of indistinct, rapidly moving heat signatures, flickering among the trees on the far ridge. They moved with a speed and coordination that no natural animal managed. But something was wrong. A cold, creeping unease began to replace Elias's taut anticipation. The pack behaved strangely. They did not rush headlong into the lure, did not charge with the reckless, predatory abandon he had come to expect from them, even the smart ones. Instead, they moved with chilling deliberation, a calculated caution. And more ominously, they skirted the main killing ground, moving along the eastern flank of the gorge, a path that led around their meticulously set trap. They knew. Then, a sudden, blinding flash of light erupted far below, at the very bottom of the canyon. Then another and another. The harsh, pulsing beams of tactical flashlights appeared, and with them, the unmistakable rumble of heavy engines, the faint metallic clank of tracked vehicles. It was not the familiar ancient sound of approaching beasts. It was the harsh, anachronistic roar of modern machinery. Elias's blood ran cold, a block of ice in his chest. His eyes darted to the thermal readouts. The heat signature spread out, forming a rapid, organized perimeter. It was the military. They had been set up. They were not hunting. They were the hunted. The first shots cracked through the night like lightning bolts, sharp and deafening, severing the heavy silence that had hung over the gorge. Not the roar of a hunting rifle, but the staccato, brutal bark of military-grade assault weapons. Chaos erupted, a sickening maelstrom of flashing muzzle flashes, the frantic thud of boots on rock, and the sudden terrified shouts of men. Special operations forces, moving with terrifying speed and precision, swarmed their positions, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness, painting the world in blinding, disorienting strokes. They approached not with caution, but with ruthless efficiency, their weapons already spitting fire. "Hold your fire!" Elias bellowed into his communication device, his voice ragged with disbelief. "They're ours!" "It's a mistake." But his words were swallowed by the cacophony, the hellish symphony of gunfire and shouts. The soldiers operating on received intelligence already fired, laying down a devastating barrage of bullets. They clearly believed the hunters were the dangerous terrorists or armed poachers described in the official narrative, the ones responsible for the carnage. There was no hesitation, no parley, only lethal intent. Maeve, from her sniper's perch, let out a cry of pain as a burst of automatic fire splintered the rock beside her head. David, trying to provide cover fire and call out their true identity, was caught in the open. Elias watched in frozen horror as his seasoned comrade, a man who had faced down horrors beyond imagining, stumbled, then fell, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his chest. Moments later, from another flank, 3 eagles, the shaman whose wisdom stretched back to epochs beyond memory, went down. His last breath a guttural gasp lost in the din. Their deaths were not just a loss of comrades. They were a cruel, agonizing blow, a betrayal by the very civilization they swore to protect. "Cease fire! Cease fire, you damn fools!" Elias screamed, his voice raw, futile. He saw the panic in his remaining team members, the terror of fighting an enemy that wore their own flag. Some fired back instinctively, desperately, but it was a losing battle. He could not fight 2 wars at once. He could not kill these soldiers, however misguided, however effectively they were being used as pawns. They were human, just like him. Then, in a lull between 2 furious bursts of fire, Elias's eyes, drawn by an ancient instinct, lifted to the distant high ridge that overlooked the entire gorge. There, silhouetted against the pale, bruised sliver of moon, stood a handful of figures. They were too far to discern features, but their posture was unmistakable. Relaxed, observant, utterly detached. He recognized them. They were the beasts. The werewolves. They stood motionless, watching the bloody spectacle below. The humans tearing each other apart, their ancient enemies being systematically eliminated by their own kind. Elias saw no frenzy, no hunger in their stillness, only a profound, chilling amusement. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, colder and sharper than any bullet. They knew. They had known everything. They had leaked the information to the military, painting the Brotherhood as the threat, turning the very power of the state against its only true defenders. Their ancient war had become a shadow play, and humanity was too blind to see the strings. Fall back, retreat, now. Elias roared into his communication device, his voice thick with agony and rage. There was nothing left to fight for here, only escape. Under the desperate covering fire of the few remaining hunters, they abandoned their positions, their precious, silver-laden gear, and the fallen bodies of their comrades. They scrambled, wounded and broken, through the treacherous mountain paths, using every ancient trail, every hidden cave and crevice known only to the Brotherhood, to shake off the relentless pursuit. Elias, a bullet wound searing his shoulder, led the shattered remnants of his team into the unforgiving night. There was no anger left in him, no fear, only a profound, soul-deep numbness. The bitterness of their defeat was a poison in his mouth, a taste he knew he would carry forever. The werewolves had not simply outmaneuvered them. They had weaponized human power, human trust, human ignorance. They had used the iron fist of the government to crush its own protectors. The ancient hunt had ended, not with a roar, but with a whisper of betrayal. The escape was a blur of raw pain and primal instinct, a desperate, scrambling flight through the unforgiving wilderness. Elias and the few survivors, a young woman from Maeve's family, barely out of her teens, whose eyes were still wide with shock, and an older, quiet man who was distantly related to David, his face a mask of grim determination, were now fugitives. They were wounded, their bodies screaming in protest, their minds numbed by the horror they'd witnessed. The government forces, under the assumption they were dangerous terrorists responsible for the attacks and the firefight, were relentless in their pursuit, their distant sirens and helicopter thrums a constant, buzzing threat on the edges of their hearing. Survival became an agonizing moment-to-moment struggle. The biting cold of the mountain night seeped into their bones, promising hypothermia. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, a hollow ache that distracted from their injuries. They had no medical supplies, only makeshift bandages fashioned from torn clothing and the desperate hope that infection did not set in. They moved only under the shroud of darkness. Their bodies ached for rest. Their minds craved sleep. But every shadow held the threat of discovery. Any human contact was out of the question. They were ghosts, hunted by both man and monster, caught in a terrifying no-man's land. Elias's mind was a torment of guilt. The faces of Maeve, David, and 3 eagles, their last moments forever seared into his memory, haunted him with every gasping breath. He had been their leader. He had led them into a trap. He revisited the ancient chronicles of the Brotherhood in his mind, the stories of their forebears, their victories, their defeats. But this felt different. This was not merely a defeat. It was the deepest, most humiliating capitulation in their 4-century history. They had not been outfought. They had been outsmarted, turned against themselves. The very foundation of his faith, the core of his existence, had been utterly shattered. All their centuries of accumulated knowledge, the meticulously developed methods of combat, the intricate understanding of their enemy, it had not merely been neutralized, it had been twisted, inverted, and cynically wielded against them. They were pawns, not in a game of checkers, but in a cosmic chess match where the rules were unknown, and the board itself was rigged. The monsters had learned to play the human game better than humans themselves. After what felt like an eternity of desperate flight, several days of constant movement and gnawing fear, they stumbled upon a temporary sanctuary. It was an abandoned mining shaft, a black maw in the side of a forgotten mountain, reeking of damp earth and mineral. It offered a brief respite from the relentless cold, a dark, claustrophobic womb where they could, for a few precious hours, rest their aching bodies and tend to their festering wounds. But even in the deepest recesses of the earth, Elias felt no true safety. The air still carried the faint, distant hum of the world's hunt for them. In the flickering light of a single scavenged flashlight, the three survivors huddled together, their voices low and strained. The young woman, her name was Clara, finally voiced the question that had been silently echoing in all their minds. How did they know Elias? How could they have known our plan? Who warned them? The older man, Samuel, nodded, his face etched with a profound, terrifying suspicion. The unspoken truth hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. It was not just a leak. It was a deep, insidious penetration. The horrifying truth, the one they all feared to voice, was that the source of the betrayal lay not in the wilderness, but much, much closer to the heart of human power. Elias, despite the searing pain in his shoulder, the exhaustion that threatened to pull him under, felt a cold, hard ember of resolve rekindle within him. The game, he knew, was far from over. This was not just about survival anymore. This was about understanding. He felt it, a primal hunter's instinct, thrumming beneath his skin. The true enemy was not in the forests anymore, not entirely. It was in the cities, in the halls of power, woven into the very fabric of civilization. He pushed himself up, wincing at the flare of pain, knowing that he had to find the answer. Even if it was the last thing he ever did, he had to see the face of their ultimate betrayer. The path ahead was dark, filled with despair, but the truth, however monstrous, was a beacon he could not ignore. Days later, the stench of stale cigarette smoke and cheap disinfectant clung to Elias in the dingy motel room on the edge of a nameless town, miles from the mountains. He was a ghost, unshaven, his clothes stained, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes to obscure his features. Clara and Samuel had gone their own ways, their will broken, their hope shattered, leaving Elias truly alone with the gnawing truth. He'd found a discarded newspaper, its headline screaming about the capture of dangerous domestic terrorists in Montana. It was the same familiar, comforting lie, but it tasted like ash in his mouth. He flicked on the television, the screen flickering to life with a blast of garish light and the drone of official voices. A federal press conference was underway, live from Washington. The image showed a polished podium, American flags draped behind it, and a panel of stern-faced men and women in dark suits. They spoke with unwavering confidence, their voices calm and reassuring. "The threat has been eliminated," one woman stated, her smile crisp and professional. "The individuals responsible for the heinous acts in the Yellowstone region have been apprehended and are now in federal custody." Then the camera cut to a series of mugshots, projected onto a large screen behind the officials. They were the faces of frightened, bewildered local farmers, men Elias had spoken to, men who had feared the big bear or the crazy folks. Now they were presented as the dangerous poachers and radical extremists responsible for the brutal attacks on both livestock and people, and for the assault on the brave military units. The narrative was perfect, watertight, seamless. For the media and the public, it was an open and shut case. Another tragic incident swiftly resolved by the unwavering hand of law enforcement. Television experts, their faces serious and sagacious, debated the motivations of these latest extremists, praising the efficiency of the armed forces, their voices filled with a false sense of closure. Elias watched, numb. The lies flowed smooth as oil, But then, one of the officials stepped forward to the podium, a man he had not noticed before. He was the deputy director of a key federal agency, one responsible for domestic security, his name lost in the fog of Elias's despair. He was impeccably dressed, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his silver hair neatly combed. There was no trace of panic in his eyes, no hint of the confusion that had plagued every other official Elias had encountered. Only flawless, serene confidence. A charismatic smile played on his lips as he addressed the cameras, a promise of safety and a return to normalcy. And then Elias saw it. It was almost imperceptible, a flicker, a subtle aberration, something only an eye trained over 400 years detected. The way the deputy director's eyes, even as he smiled, remained too still, too unblinking, reflecting the camera's harsh light with an unnerving, glassy perfection. His smile, though wide and engaging, never quite reached those eyes. It was a perfect, practiced contortion of facial muscles, devoid of genuine warmth, and the subtle, almost imperceptible grace in his movements, the fluid, effortless way he shifted his weight, the perfect posture, a predatory stillness beneath the veneer of human civility. It was not a mistake, not an error in the traditional sense, but a horrifying perfection that bespoke an ancient alien presence wearing human skin. In that instant, a cold, crushing clarity descended upon Elias, a truth so terrible it stole his breath. 400 years. 4 centuries of the Brotherhood's endless hunt, their relentless pursuit. But the truth was, in all that time, the werewolves had not merely survived. They had evolved. They had learned not just to hide, but to flourish. They had learned to use the very structures of human power, the very institutions of the state, as their impenetrable shield. They had infiltrated, not just influenced, but become the government itself. And now they sat at the highest tables, signing the laws, controlling the finances, shaping the narratives, manipulating the information flow. The deputy director's words, intended to soothe a nation, sounded to Elias like the triumphant roar of a predator, a chilling declaration of victory from within the lion's den. He was a werewolf. Elias knew it with every fiber of his being. And he was not alone. The subtle, perfect flaws he had observed were not unique to him. There were others, higher up, deeper within the system. Elias reached out, his hand trembling, and pressed the power button on the remote control. The television screen snapped to black, plunging the motel room into a heavy, oppressive silence. There was no anger left in him, no fear, only a vast, aching emptiness, a profound stillness that resonated with the silence of the room. Everything he had believed, everything his ancestors had fought for, everything that gave his life meaning, was not merely lost. It had been twisted, corrupted, and ultimately made irrelevant. The hunt, his family's eternal hunt, was not just paused. It was irrevocably, utterly lost. The silence of the motel room pressed in on Elias, a suffocating blanket woven from the fabric of his devastating realization. He sat there, hunched on the edge of the threadbare bed, the cold dread an anchor in his gut. The true scale of it was more immense, more terrifying, than any nightmare he'd ever endured. The werewolves were no longer lurking in the primeval forests, shadowy figures on the fringes of civilization. They had stepped out of the shadows, not to reveal themselves, but to inhabit the very centers of human power. They sat at the mahogany tables in Washington, their tailored suits impeccable, their smiles practiced, their eyes holding that unnerving ancient stillness. They signed the laws. They controlled the flow of currency. They managed the intricate web of information that shaped a nation's reality. The horror of their infiltration was not just that they influenced the government. They were the government. They were the ones deciding which threats were to be eliminated, like the Brotherhood, and which were to be ignored, or more chillingly, exploited for their own inscrutable ends. The very mechanisms designed to protect humanity, its institutions, its laws, its media, had become their tools, their shields, their means of control. They had become the shepherds, and humanity, for all its technological prowess and self-proclaimed intelligence, was nothing more than a vast, unwitting flock. The most profound, most soul-crushing terror for Elias was the realization that humanity had lost the war long before it even knew a war was being fought. It was not lost on a bloody battlefield in some remote wilderness. It was lost in the hushed, carpeted offices of power, in the sterile newsrooms, in the very fabric of society itself. The fight had been compromised from within, not by an enemy with claws and teeth, but by an enemy with cleverness and patience, an enemy that understood the human condition better than humans understood themselves. What was there left to do? Who could he tell? Who would ever believe a lone, broken man, now branded a terrorist, whose family had harbored such a monstrous secret for centuries? His words would be dismissed as the ravings of a madman, his truth an insane fantasy in a world obsessed with quantifiable facts and controlled narratives. He was a ghost in a machine he could no longer comprehend, let alone fight. The isolation was absolute, a profound, crushing loneliness that dwarfed any physical pain. This was no mere horror story. This was cosmic dread made flesh. The enemy was not just physically invulnerable. They were integrated, a silent cancer at the heart of the world. The true nightmare lay in the chilling certainty that everything humanity cherished, its news, its laws, its perceived safety, was now under the complete dominion of creatures for whom human beings were nothing more than a resource, a livestock herd to be managed, culled, and eventually consumed. The illusion of free will, of self-determination, was the most sophisticated trap of all. Elias, the last of the Brotherhood, sat in the suffocating silence, alone with this monstrous truth. He was no longer a hunter. His purpose had been stripped away, replaced by the unbearable burden of knowledge no one else would ever share. His path, from this moment forward, was that of a wraith, a shadow observing a world that lived in a beautiful, horrifying illusion. He was a witness to the ultimate defeat, condemned to watch the slow, inexorable subjugation of his species. On the television screen, now muted and playing in the background, the deputy director's image reappeared, perhaps on a replay, perhaps in another news segment. He was smiling, his head tilted slightly, an aura of serene authority emanating from him. And for a fleeting, impossible moment, his eyes shifted, turned, and locked directly with the camera lens. It was a gaze that pierced through the screen, through the stale air of the motel room, and settled deep into Elias's soul. In that perfect, utterly human smile, Elias saw not reassurance but an ancient, devilish triumph. The curtain had fallen, and the show had just begun.